2,000 years ago, there was a man hanging on a cross just outside of Jerusalem. And the man, Jesus, Yeshua, was the Son of God, God in the flesh. And so you think of that and you ask yourself, what on earth was God doing on a cross? Suffering and dying like a common criminal. You think of this, it doesn't actually make sense. And because of that, it has become the subject of mockery for many atheists. And even for many Christians, the whole purpose of substitutionary sacrifice and atonement and redemption is still very vague. And most do not get further than just saying, well, he died for me and he paid for my sins and that's it. And of course, maybe I shouldn't even mention this, but you have religious leaders like the Pope that call the whole thing a failure. So that's one thing that we think of in these days, and the other thing is, given the circumstances in the world at this moment, that many people say, why does God allow suffering? Why doesn't he do something? And unbelievers, strangely enough, they blame the God that they don't believe in for all this. And many believers still have the same questions. Why is this happening? Why doesn't God do something? But with that they forget what God has done. Because he did do something. That's this, of course, the scenario, the scene that I just described before. He brought hope where there was hopelessness, and he brought life where there was death. So the question is not so much what God has done and why God allows things to happen. The question is what we have done and what we allow to happen. There lies the problem. Jesus was crucified and he died at Passover. And a feast that was in place at least since the Exodus. Even prior, there's a prior occasion of this feast in Scripture. We looked at that, it's in Genesis, but I don't want to go there now. Let's start with the Exodus. That's what we know best. When the Israelites left Egypt, the fact that Jesus died on that same day during that feast obviously is not a coincidence. God had planned it long before. Actually, even before the foundation of the earth. And I want just to read two verses that testify of this. One is from Revelation 13, verse 8. He's speaking there, of course, about the first and the second beast. But then it says in verse 8, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. That's the beast, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, that's Jesus, slain from the foundation of the world. He was slain from the foundation of the world. And in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 19 and 20, we find similar words. That is how we are bought, how we are redeemed, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. So it's not a plan B that God came up with after all the rest failed. It is something, it was planned even before the foundation of the world. It was just manifest in a certain time in the whole plan of God. But he had foreordained it before the foundation of the world. And it's very hard for us to grasp this because we are constrained by time. But God is not. God is above time. He could have done this and still have what we call the laws of causability. First action and then reaction. Still have this all in place and not violate our free will in the process. So in this, Jesus became the Passover Lamb. In Hebrew, the Korban Pesach. And that is a big deal. We have to understand what the Passover Lamb is to understand what Jesus is or should be to us. So this is the first thing I want to look at. The Passover Lamb. What is it? And for that, indeed, we go to the Exodus. When the Israelites were in Egypt, God brought these plagues. We know the 10 plagues that came upon the Egyptians. Now the first 3 plagues, they befell all that dwelled in Israel. Also in Egypt, I must say. Also the Israelites. So the Israelites suffered also from these first plagues. But then God made a separation. We read it a few weeks ago in Exodus 8, verse 22. God says, I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies, that was the next plague, shall go there. So he made a separation. No more were the Israelites to suffer these plagues, only the Egyptians. And this is something we see also today. We live in the end times, and Jesus clearly described this in Matthew 24, Luke 21. There are quote-unquote plagues that we will also suffer before God draws the separation. And so, Jesus said, in this world you will find tribulation. We will suffer through things before there is separation, and we must endure. So the next 7 plagues in Exodus, I'm not saying we have 3 plagues and 7 plagues now, but here in the example of Exodus, there were 10 plagues. The next 7 plagues did not befall the Israelites, with one exception, and that's the last plague. The last plague was death. Death of all the firstborn, both man and beast. It did not just pass the Israelites. They had to do something for it. And I want to read it from Exodus chapter 12. You find it there 2 times. One time when God gives Moses the instruction, and the second time when Moses gives the people the instruction. He relays it to the people. I want to read the second instance. This is in verse 21. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said unto them, Draw out and take you a lamb according to your families, and kill the Passover. Here you see the lamb is called the Passover. This is very strange if you think of it. For us we know, but when Moses spoke this to the people, they had no idea what this meant. The word Passover had no meaning until after the event, of course. But kill the Passover. The lamb is the Passover. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 side posts with the blood that is in the basin, and none of you shall go out at the door of his house until the morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and on the 2 side posts, the Lord will pass over the door, and will not suffer the destroyer to come unto your houses to smite you. So it's a clear instruction, and also the reason is given why to do this. So they had to take the lamb inside, and if we read, of course, earlier in this chapter, we see that they had to keep it inside their house for 4 days. And during these 4 days they were also to observe and inspect, to see whether this lamb was without blemish. And after the 4 days, or at the end of the 4th day, they had to kill it. And that was not a pleasant thing. Just try to imagine that you have to kill your own pet. That's basically what it is. It's a little lamb that's inside the house, and you feed it, you cuddle it, and all this during these days. You get attached to it, and then you have to kill it. And even if there are children in the house, this would be more painful. But that grief, that sorrow, that was part of the process. This is a very important part, actually. The 4 days the lamb was inside the house. If you were to walk outside in the street, you would not know it. Maybe you sometimes could hear the bleating, but in general you would not know it. It's an inward process. It's inside the homes. But then, after they had killed it, they would put the blood on the doorpost. That's outside. That's an outward testimony of something that has happened inside. So we have first this inward process, and then you have the outward testimony, you can say. It was on the door. They didn't put it on the wall or anywhere else, but on the door, on the doorposts. And the door is, of course, the entrance. Nothing could just enter without passing and going under this blood. So it's the entrance of the house that is protected, and that was the whole point. That is what God also said. And the destroyer will pass. He is not able to enter. So what do we see from this? They were saved literally by the blood of the Lamb. Because of the blood of the Lamb, death would not come in. So in order to be saved by the blood of the Lamb, you see now there are a few conditions. So this is why this plague is different from the other plagues. It did not just pass the Israelites, it passed only when they did these things. They had, first of all, it had to be there. Let me put it in first person. It had to be your lamb. It's not just a lamb you take, or you slaughter it outside in the field and you take the blood to your house. It lived inside your house. It's your lamb. He has to live in your house, and that, of course, you can use as a metaphor for your own life, your own temple, your own body. He has to live in you. That's the first thing that we see here. So it's not just a magic formula, as we often hear and see, that people say, well, just spread the blood of Christ on you, and you will be saved. No, this doesn't go like that. He has to live in you. He has to be your lamb. It's not a formula that you can apply and that anyone just can apply. You have to be his, and he has to be yours. You have to be attached to him. And you see, as with this little lamb that lives in the house and then has to be killed, you have to have genuine sorrow over his death. If he is truly your lamb, you have sorrow over his death. Why? Because you kill it. And it is your sins that kill him. That's why he died, so to speak. Of course, it's God who crushed his son for that purpose. But indirect, this is what it is. But it doesn't stop there. If we go back to Exodus 12 and verse 8, after they had done this, they were not just to wait until the whole thing was over. It says, and they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire, his head with his legs, and with the purtenance thereof. And you shall let nothing of it remain until the morning. And that which remaineth of it until the morning you shall burn with fire. And thus shall ye eat it, with your loins girded, with your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So they had to eat it, they had to consume it, and it had to be completely consumed. Even if there was anything left, they had to burn it. The lamb would be their food. And even more than that, it was actually their last decent meal before they would go on their journey. And it was not a lavish dinner with lots of celebration. Again, there was sorrow. It was their lamb. And also what was happening outside at the same time was not pleasant. All the firstborn were dying. man and beast. It was not a happy time. And you see also the way they were eating it was also not nice, let me say it that way. With unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. It's not the most tasty food you can have. And also they had to eat it in a haste, with the loins girded, shoes on the feet, and the staff in the hand. This means ready to go. It is ready to go, and it's sober meal, and it is also a meal that has this character of we have to eat quickly because we have to leave. And they were forced inside the homes. They could not gather together with different families and groups to have a nice meal. If you compare this with the seders that you have today, well, not this year, but all the other years, these Passover seder meals, they are with many different things that you can eat, with wine, with all kinds of things, and families gathering in large groups. It's really nothing like this sober, hasty meal that we read here of. And so this year is in that sense very special, because now you see, because of all the lockdowns, that people cannot have these luxurious meals with large groups as they were used to the past years, but they're doing exactly what we read here. They are confined, they have to stay in their homes, and outside is death. And of course you have to ask yourself which one of them are actually truly covered by the blood of the Lamb, but it's another thing. But it's really something to reflect on. Hopefully the situation will make many be like what we read here, ready to go. Because that is what it is. You have to eat it with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, staff in your hand, ready to go. Because the Exodus is soon. It's soon. So this meal, this was also part of the process. It's not just the blood. You see, the blood is first of all the blood of your lamb, the lamb that you are attached to, that has lived in your house. But secondly, you consume it. And so that's another question you have to ask yourself as a Christian. Do you feed on Christ? Do you consume him? Is he your living bread? If we go to Matthew 26, verse 26, that is where Jesus has his Passover meal with his disciples. And what you will note if you read that is that he has, basically there are two items that they are consuming. There's bread and there's wine. And you would say, well, that's not correct. Where's the lamb? They don't eat lamb. And when Jesus then gives the bread in Matthew 26:26, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Now again, this is weird. If you think of it, it's weird. He gives bread and he says, "This is my body." But if you think of what we just read from Exodus, what were they to consume? The Passover lamb. And now Jesus says, "This is my body." There is no lamb, there's only bread. So he is identifying himself with the Passover lamb. This is what he's basically saying. I am the Passover lamb, and it's symbolized in this bread. So eat it, consume it. This is your Passover lamb. And the consuming it is part of the process of the whole atonement. He is the Passover lamb. And then in John 6 verse 51 we read again that Jesus identifies himself with the Passover lamb. He says there, "I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." Again, he identifies his body, his flesh with the bread. The bread symbolizes his body. It is not his body, it symbolizes, of course. And then he says, this is for the life of the world. This is what the Passover Lamb does. It saves. So we get a few things from this. One, he has to live in you, be part of your household. This is very important. I use this word household very much because it's actually very often in the Bible the very first word of the Genesis 1 verse 1, Bereshit, the first letter, the Beth, it means house or household. And I've said this before, this book is about the household of God. And so you have to be part of this household, and put in a different way, Jesus has to be part of your household. He has to live in your house, in your life. That is the first thing. Then there has to be a testimony, an outward appearance of this life in him. So it's not only inside, it also has to be visible on the outside, on the doorpost of your life. On that which, when people meet you, it's like they visit your house. The first thing they see is the door. And they have to see right away something is different in this house, in this life, in this person. So there has to be an outward testimony. And this is the result of the inward life in Christ. And thirdly, you have to feed on him. You have to live by him daily. And we looked at this as well a while ago. In the Lord's Prayer, give me this day my daily bread. The word daily there, epiousion, it is super essential. That is what it means. He has to be super essential. This is what you live on. This is the living bread on which you feed, which you consume. So these are the attributes that we see in the Exodus. It is much more than only blood on the doorpost which makes the death pass over. This is the result of all this. But the process, you see, is much deeper than that. It's the Passover Lamb, the Pesach Korban. But again, it doesn't end there. It's not just a short relationship, 4 days, and then the lamb is killed and you're saved. No, the relationship continues. And we see it again in the Exodus. After they have consumed the lamb, then the next day they go on their way. And they will travel through the desert. And who is in front of them, visibly even, in this pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire at night? God is leading them. From now on, God is leading them. He is leading their life. So the relationship actually just began with all this. The presence of God now became more clear to the Israelites than it was ever before. When they were toiling in bondage, they might have thought, where is this God of our forefathers? We are just slaves and there's no hope. How do we ever get out of this life and out of this world? Just as many people are asking today. Well, then God performs a miracle if you allow him. So, we make a mistake if we think that we are so-called sealed and sanctified the moment we accept Christ, and that's it. And we can go about and do our business as usual. That's not it. Sanctification is a process. And that became clear in the desert. After God instructed Moses and Aaron to build the tabernacle, and he gave instructions how to serve there, he instructed that the priests had to wash their hands and feet every single time they would enter the sanctuary. It was an ongoing process. It was not a one-time thing. Now you're saved, you're cleansed, you're okay. No, it was all the time repeating. All these 40 years, and after that still the same in the temple. And so is our relationship with him. It's an ongoing process. The whole process of sanctification, it's a daily thing. That's why it's daily bread. And a big part of it is, of course, the Word. So we must seek him all the time. It was upon the Israelites to look upon this cloud and on this pillar of fire at night, and to see it and think, and behold, this is God, this is our God who led us out of bondage. and we want to follow him. And of course they failed many times dramatically, as do we. But this is what we should do. We should seek him. If we go to John chapter 20, this is where we find the story of the resurrection, actually. This is what is being celebrated today. It's called Resurrection Sunday. Mary comes to the grave. Why does he go to the grave? Because he is seeking the Lord. Now that he has died, her relationship does not stop with him. She's still seeking him. And this is the point. And when she comes to the grave and meets Jesus, Jesus says to her, "Woman, why weepest thou? Whom seekest thou?" So the lamb that you were attached to, it's dead. It gives sorrow, it gives grief. But it does not give grief in the sense that we should now be depressed. On the contrary, Jesus says, "Why are you weeping? Who are you seeking?" And he doesn't ask us because he's wondering. This is a rhetorical question. He is basically saying, "I'm here, and I'm alive, and I've been here all the time. Stop weeping. Stop searching. I'm here." So this relationship continues after, just as in the Exodus, it continues. Now, Jesus' resurrection did not happen just any day. Just as his crucifixion and death didn't happen just any day. It happened on that specific day of Passover, as he was the Passover Lamb. So the resurrection was on a special day. And John chapter 20 verse 1 reveals that. Which day it was. And the words being used there are very important. It says there, the first day of the week cometh Mary Magdalene early. The first day of the week. So the first day of the week on the biblical calendar is always the day after the Sabbath. Which means on the secular Western calendar, that is Sunday. Yeah, if the Sabbath is Saturday, then the first day of the week is always a Sunday. So that is when she came to the grave. We know from this that it was the day after the regular Sabbath. They could also have said the day after the Sabbath, but then there would be a question mark, because which Sabbath? But now we know it's the regular weekly Sabbath. Let's say the Saturday, and it's the day after the Saturday. Now, why is this important? Then we have to go to Leviticus 23. We've been there many times, but this chapter is very important in the Torah and in understanding the fulfillment of Jesus' work. Here in verse 10 and 11 we read, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, to be accepted for you. On the morrow, after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." So, two things. One is first a side note. I always find this intriguing that God gives these instructions when he says, when you come into the land and you have harvest. So he's already speaking of them being in the land and having the fruits of it while they are still in the desert. So it should be very hopeful to them that God is already seeing the result. But anyway, what does he say? The first fruits of the land, you have to wave it before the Lord. That's called a wave offering. It's not burned or consumed, it's presented to the Lord, dedicated to the Lord. Why? To be accepted. So the Lord accepts it and he blesses it, he sanctifies it. When on the morrow, the morning after the Sabbath. So here we see the same words we just read in John 20. It was the morning after the Sabbath. Now the question, of course, is when you read this here in Leviticus, which Sabbath? Which Sabbath is this? Therefore you have to back up a little bit. Verse 5. There it says, in the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. This is what we read also or we didn't read it today, but it says also in Exodus 12. The 14th of the first month is the Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is a feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. So it begins the next day. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. In the first day you shall have a holy convocation. That means a Sabbath, but this is not a weekly Sabbath, this is a holy, extra holy day. You shall do no servile work therein. Servile work, by the way, means work in servitude. So, like you work for a master, or you do your job. It doesn't mean you cannot do anything, but you don't do your normal work as you do in the other days of the week. Anyway, so we have here the Passover and the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 15th. And then it continues with what we read about Feast of First Fruits. That is the first new weekday after Passover. That is what it is. So after the Passover has begun and the Feast of Unleavened Bread has begun after the 14th and 15th of Nisan, the first Sabbath and then the first day after that. That is what we talk about. And that's a very interesting situation that is created here. And this is often missed because of our church tradition. All around the world in Christian churches now, today it's Resurrection Sunday. And here in the Eastern Orthodox Church it's a week later. But it's Resurrection Sunday, and this means that last week was the Palm Sunday. This is how it's always celebrated in Protestant and Catholic circles. It's always on Sundays. And that is not correct. It's very interesting if you look at this. It's not just interesting, but you see that the conditions are so specific that only God could have orchestrated all this. And that's my point actually here. So, Nisan 14, Passover is always on Nisan 14. This is the point, what it says here. The date is given. The date. It's always on the 14th. This means it's always on different days. Yes, it's like your birthday. It's on the same date every year, but it's on different days. One year you have your birthday on a Monday, the next year you have it on a Tuesday, and so on. So the date is fixed. That means that the day is variable. It's different in different years. That means that Passover can fall on any day. It's not always on Sunday or on Wednesday or Thursday or whatever. It can be on any day. And so if first fruits is the first new weekday after that, then the difference between Passover and first fruits can be different. It's variable because first fruits is always on a fixed day, but not on a fixed date. It's always on the first weekday. So I want just to illustrate that because maybe it's a bit confusing. So here you see, for example, if Passover were to be on a Monday, that's there on the top, the 14th on a Monday, then the next day, the 15th, is the Holy Convocation. That is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that's why I made it red. That's on a Monday, so the whole week has to pass until Saturday, which is the regular weekly Sabbath. And then the day after that is the first day of a new week, which would be the Feast of First Fruits. So if you count from Passover, you see that it is the 6th day would be the Feast of First Fruits. If Passover falls on a Monday, which it does every 7 years roughly. There are also leap years in between, so it changes a bit, but roughly every 7 years, this is the situation. The next year it would be on a Tuesday, and it would be the 5th day would be first fruits. That is what we see. Now we know from what we read in John 20 verse 1, that the resurrection was on the first day of the week, the Feast of First Fruits. We also know from Scripture that Jesus was 3 days and 3 nights, 3 nights in the grave, and he rose on the 3rd day. So if you count back from first fruits 3 days, then you know on what day that year Passover was. And that's the situation that I have here. So Passover, the 14th, was on a Thursday, or actually begins on a Wednesday evening, because the Hebrew days begin at sunset, not at midnight. That's why it's a little bit shifted. So Wednesday evening was when he had his meal with his disciples. And Thursday evening before sunset he was put in the grave. Thursday, that means that Friday, the 15th, first day of unleavened bread, we just read in Leviticus 23, was the Holy Convocation, a Sabbath. That's why his body had to be put in the grave the evening before, because the next day was a Sabbath, and it gives actually a description for this Sabbath in John 19, I think, in verse 31. The Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation that the body should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day, and then it says in between brackets, for that Sabbath day was a high day. So this was not a weekly regular Sabbath, but it was this special Sabbath, first day of unleavened bread. Then you have the Saturday. I see you made the red lines on the wrong place. It should be here. It's too bad. So you have the Sabbath here, the regular Sabbath. So you have 2 Sabbaths next to each other, and then you have the Sunday, the first day of the week, which is the Feast of First Fruits. So these red lines, they should not be here. Anyway, they should be here. There's 2 Sabbaths next to each other, back to back. That is the point. And then you see that it is on the 3rd day, first fruits, and that there are also 1, 2, 3 nights that Jesus was in the grave. This is a specific situation that only occurs once every 7 years, roughly. So if Jesus would have been crucified a year earlier, the 3rd day would not have been on the Feast of First Fruits. The resurrection would not have been on the Feast of First Fruits. If it would have been a year later, same thing. It had to be specifically in that year. That is the point. So it's a very specific situation. And you see from Leviticus that God had created these conditions long before. He knew, of course, how it would work out, because he knew the exact timing. But it shows also that this is not something man can orchestrate. There is thousands of years in between these events, and the way the whole calendar was built. And so it's a very specific situation that is not easily to be fulfilled. And that shows that God indeed had foreordained all this before the foundation of the world. And it goes even a step further if we go to Genesis chapter 8, verse 4. That is the end of the flood. Genesis 8, verse 4, it says there, and the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. So, the end of the flood, when the ark landed on solid ground, it was the 17th, just as it was that Feast of First Fruits when Jesus rose from the dead. Now you would say, but wait a minute, it says here the 17th of the 7th month, and not the 17th of the 1st month. This is not correct. Yes, it is. That is an extra condition, extra difficulty that God built in to make it even more complicated to be fulfilled just by chance. In Exodus 12 verse 2, when God gives the instructions for the Passover, he says, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months. So that was actually the 7th month, and God says to Moses, but from now on this is the first month. So what was the 7th month in Genesis 8 now becomes the first month. So there is also this change in calendar. Again, God knew all this ahead of time. So on our calendar we can see this. That's why we have these two rings, this orange and the blue one. Initially, the month of Tishri was the first month. That is what we read. The 7th month. This is what we read in Genesis. I say it wrong. It was the first month, and so the ark landed in the 7th month. That's what it is, the 17th. But then God changed it, and now the 7th month becomes the first month, and the first becomes the 7th subsequently. So this is what happened, and that's why we have a new year, the 1st of Nisan, and there is another New Year's feast in the 1st of Tishri, which is Rosh Hashanah. That's the civil New Year. The religious New Year is 1st of Nisan. So these are things that we can discover upon careful reading of the scriptures, and from that we see that how perfectly God orchestrated everything, but also how many grades of difficulty He created for this to be fulfilled. Only He could do this, and we've seen, of course, the same with the birth of Jesus. So Jesus was crucified and died on the feast of Passover. He rose from the dead on the feast of first fruits, and that could only have happened in that specific year. So just as after the flood, God made a new beginning with man. It's a resurrection of creation, you can say, when the flood ended, a new beginning. And so He did with Jesus' resurrection. It's the new Adam, new covenant, no more death, but life eternal. First fruits is the first new life that springs after the long winter. There is the first fruits of the land. That is what it means. It's the first produce, and God says, "You dedicate this to me." Paul makes the link also very clear in 1 Corinthians 15, which is really a beautiful chapter. It reveals so much. Verse 20, he says, "But now is Christ risen from the dead, and become the first fruits of them that slept." Christ has become the first fruits. And he says this because Christ rose on the Feast of First Fruits. And then later in this chapter, same chapter, 1 Corinthians 15, he explains that the dead in Christ shall rise at the last trump. Also in Thessalonians we find this. And then even in Revelation in chapter 20 we learn that at the end of the 7 years the tribulation saints resurrect. And all this is the first resurrection. So Jesus is the first fruits. Then you have the harvest, that is those that resurrect at the last trump, at the rapture. That's the harvest. And then you have the gleaning of the field, that are the tribulation saints. So these three phases of the harvest we find in the first resurrection. So, to wrap it up, what is so special about first fruits? Why did Jesus have to resurrect on the first fruits? Again, this is essential for the whole process of our redemption and of the atonement through Jesus' blood. It's not just nice coincidences or just to show, for God to show how precise He can work. In Leviticus 23 again, we read this, that in verse 10, that He says, "When you come into the land, you reap the harvest, the first thereof you shall bring." And the priest has to be brought to the priest, and the priest shall wave it before the Lord. And then it gives the reason, to be accepted for you. If you don't do this, then it's not accepted. This is how it becomes accepted. In Exodus 13, we read a similar thing. Sanctify unto me all the firstborn, verse 2 of chapter 13, whatsoever opened the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beast, is mine. So here, it's not only the produce of the land, it's also all the firstborn of man and beast. And in Deuteronomy 26, the first 11 verses, you can read again about this Feast of First Fruits, where all this is laid out. So God asks from the Israelites to dedicate all the first fruits and the firstborn. In Egypt, the firstborn died on Passover, and God says, you have to dedicate your firstborn to me. They are sanctified to the Lord. The idea of the wave offering of first fruits is for the Lord to sanctify it, and through that to sanctify the rest of the harvest. This is the point. That's why it has to be the first fruits. And you see that the people don't do this themselves. It's the priest that does it. In Deuteronomy 26, you can read that they would put the first fruits of the land in baskets, and they would place these baskets on the doorsteps of the temple. And then the priest would take these baskets and do this wave offering to the Lord. So if Jesus is the first fruits, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, then he too had to be presented to the Lord as a wave offering. Because this is very important, because of that, the rest of the harvest would be sanctified, would be accepted. And the rest of the harvest is us. So we read also in Leviticus 23 and in John 20 verse 1 that this happened in the morning after the Sabbath. So that's what Leviticus 23 says. So in John 20, Mary was at the grave at that very day, the Feast of First Fruits. And then once he recognizes Jesus, we don't read it, but apparently she wanted to embrace him or to touch him. And in verse 17 then Jesus says, touch me not, because I am not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. So he forbids, or he stops Mary from touching him. And he gives also the reason why. Because I have not yet ascended to my Father. And so, when you don't know too much about all these things, you might think this has to do with the ascension that would happen 40 days later. But that's not so. Why is it not so? Because if you go a bit down in the same chapter, you'll find that Jesus appears to his disciples. Thomas is not there. And so later the other disciples tell Thomas that Jesus had appeared, and he says, I don't believe it unless I put my finger in his wounds. And so in verse 27 it then says, Jesus says to Thomas, reach hither thy finger and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless but believing. So he tells him, touch me, and you can verify for yourself that it's me. So if the words that Jesus spoke to Mary would have to do with the ascension 50 days later, then of course Thomas would also not have been able to touch him. So that's obviously not it. And 40 days later was also not the Feast of First Fruits. The first fruit had to be presented on the morning after the Sabbath. That very morning that Mary was there at the grave and met Jesus. And so Jesus says, touch me not, for I am not ascended to my Father. But go, he sends her away, go to my brethren and say to them what? Not Jesus lives? No, say to them, I ascend to my Father. Specifically this he had to say, that Jesus would ascend to the Father. And think of this again, later he appears to them. So, this is strange. Why does he appear if he ascended to the Father? Because he ascended and he came back. And after that, they could touch him. And so this is exactly what happens with the first fruit. On the morning of first fruit, it's presented to the Lord by the priest. And after that, it can be used. It's not consumed or burnt, or it's for consumption. It's okay. But it has to be presented, dedicated to the Lord. All the first produce of the land and the firstborn. So it means that when Jesus sent Mary away, and he did this on a purpose, she had to go because he had to first finish this work. This was part of the whole plan. After he sent her away, he ascended to heaven. On that very morning of the resurrection, he ascended to heaven to be presented before God. He says, to my Father and your Father, my God and your God. To be present. So he doesn't, at that moment, he doesn't identify himself with God, but as something else, namely the first fruits. He ascends to be presented as first fruits. And through that, God accepts, that's the word that is used in Leviticus, God accepts or sanctifies all of the harvest. All the saints that will resurrect after him at the rapture and later on at the gleaning, at the end of the tribulation. They are sanctified because this is an essential step of the whole process, of the whole fulfillment of the law that Jesus does with his death and resurrection. This is part of it. So we usually don't hear of this because other than what we find here in this chapter, there are no indications that this event even happened. But if you study the law and you read carefully these words, you see that this had to have happened, actually. And this is now a little conjecture, but I think that this was even the reason why these two angels were there in the grave. When Mary first looked into the grave, she sees these two angels sitting there at the head and the feet of where Jesus had laid. And you think, why are the angels there? What are they doing? Most likely they were fulfilling the role of the priest that presents the first fruits to the Lord. They came to escort Jesus, so to speak, to the temple, at the heavenly temple, to present him as first fruits. That's not for sure, but that is what I think and what makes sense. Sanctifying the first fruit is a symbol of sanctifying all of the harvest. And so this means the church and the tribulation saints. And therefore this is very important. And therefore you see that Jesus was very serious when he said to Mary, touch me not. Because this had to happen first. This was an essential step of his work. It was actually the completion of it. So we can have confidence in being part of a sanctified harvest because of his resurrection and because of him being the first fruits. This is the whole point that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 15. This verse that we read, he says Jesus became the first fruit of the resurrection in verse 20. But he says even before that, if Christ is not risen, in verse 14, it begins already in verse 13, and before even. But he says, if Christ be not risen, then our preaching is in vain. This is super essential principle. And your faith is also in vain. We are even found false witnesses of God, because we have testified of God that he raised up Christ, whom he raised not up. If so be that the dead rise not. If the dead rise not, then Christ is not raised. This is, think of the harvest. If there's no first fruits, there is nothing. There is also no harvest. It is the first proof of the harvest. So this has to be. And this means, he says then in verse 18, this means also all that are fallen asleep in Christ, they perished. They died and they will be dead forever. And then of course he comes to speak about the first fruits. This is a very important step. And so this day that we celebrate the resurrection, we celebrate of course that he died, and with that, with his blood paid for our sins, that because of that, death will pass over. That is one part of the thing. He overcame death, but he rose, and he ascended to heaven, and he through his resurrection, we, the harvest, we are sanctified. We are to be accepted by God. And so this is a beautiful thing, and that's why it's so important that his resurrection had to be on the Feast of First Fruits, and that God orchestrated it so that it could happen only in that specific year, which is really very profound. The thing that is for us is that we are sure, that we have to make sure that he is our Lamb, that he lives in our house, that we are part of him and he is part of us. We abide in him, as we read in John 15. This is what we have to be certain of for ourselves, so that we are indeed part of this harvest. If not, of course, everything is in vain. So it's a wonderful day. It's maybe the most important day in the biblical year. And the fact that today, 2020, we are all in our homes, and very much like the time of the Exodus, should help us to reflect even more on this. That it is not a matter of big partying, and we know it certainly also here in Greece. There is also always a lot of going out and eating and fireworks, and it's a big thing. But if you read it in Exodus, it's actually very sober. It's a happy occasion, eventually, of course, but it's also sober, and it's also very much ready to go. You're ready to go. You don't have a lavish meal with lots of drinking and eating, and no, it's with the stuff in your hands, ready to go. And this is where we must be. At this point in time, we must be ready to go, because the Exodus is soon. Amen.